Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome to this presentation on hidden gems in FusionReactor. My name is Charlie Earhart, and I'll be your host for the next hour or so. And I'll do some more introduction of myself in a moment, but let's go ahead and get into the presentation. So as I said, I hope you'll learn a ton. Most folks think they know what FusionReactor can do. You're here for hidden gems, so hopefully you have a sense that there's more than you realize. But I work with people using it every day, and a lot of folks think they've used everything there is, and every time I show people stuff, they learn something new. Pretty much every time I show people stuff, they learn something new. So we put this together to show you some of those things that people often miss. And some of them may be major features that they don't even know exist, or some modest but useful minor feature that they never knew existed. And so that's the goal here, to uncover those hidden gems, things you might have missed, and aspects of things you use every day that maybe you just never noticed. And this is for whether you use FusionReactor 6, the latest release, or 5, or perhaps even 4. I was working with somebody just a couple weeks ago who was still on FusionReactor 4. And you really ought to update to the later versions. 5 especially and above is much better. No more flash, all kinds of, no more need to wrap data sources. But anyway, this is not a talk on what's new on FusionReactor 5. And it's also not a talk on what's new in FusionReactor 6. So let me be clear about that. I'm not here going to talk necessarily about what's new in FusionReactor 6. I'll mention things that apply whether you're on 6 or 5 or 4. We have a whole separate talk on hidden gems in FusionReactor 6. So I am speaking to those who are either experienced with FusionReactor or maybe are rather new to it, because it's great. If you're new to it, it's good for you to learn the little hidden gems because they'll make you better right out of the gate, whereas sometimes people who've used it for years never notice these things. They're often disappointed if they call those years they didn't know certain features were there. And again, the focus here is on practical aspects of what you missed. This is not a what is all in FusionReactor. There are going to be many things that are in FusionReactor that might even technically be considered hidden gems, but I'm not going to focus on them because you could probably find them on their own. I just don't think they're the most important things, but the things I want to show you are things that I think will make your life easier every day when you use FusionReactor. And the session is being recorded, and everybody who's signed up for this will get an email with a link to the presentation and to these slides. So make sure you hear me saying this. You will get these slides that you're looking at. You'll get them, and they're updated since the previous version. So, and you may have noticed on the previous screen, we ask that you don't share it publicly because it is changing all the time, and we want people to always get the best one that's going to be made available. But you'll get this stuff. So the point is, don't worry about writing down every little detail. Like sometimes I'll write down, here's how to get to this particular feature. Just listen to what I'm saying. Don't worry about writing down how to get there. When you get the slides, you'll see how to get there. All right, so let's start with a couple quick polls. It's helpful to hear from people where they are in their use of FusionReactor. So I'm going to start with first, how often do you use FusionReactor? And I'll just give you about 5 to 10 seconds to answer that. Oh, sorry. Missed a little button there. There you go. So now take about 5 to 10 seconds. And while you're doing this, Kai has asked if this is the same as the one held on the 7th of September. I can't remember if the 7th, I think this would be yet. So this is the Hidden Gems in FusionReactor. That was Hidden Gems in FusionReactor. Then there was a Hidden Gems in FusionReactor 6. And in a couple of weeks, we'll have a Hidden Gems in FusionReactor 6. So it's the same in the sense of being Hidden Gems in FusionReactor. It is different in that it's been improved in some ways. But if you were at that one, then yeah, there's no reason to be at this one. And the title and the description were the same, so I'm sorry if somehow you interpreted that as being somehow a third part. It's not. There's just 2 talks, and they'll be offered repeatedly. Okay, and I got the answer, and it's in the order that I expected it to be and about the ratios I expected it to be, so thank you for that. And then next, what's the latest version that you're using? It's helpful for me to know where you're coming from in terms of what people are using, what version. That might influence some of what I say. Okay, and it's, actually the majority are on. By the way, Vivek, rather than write your answer in as a question, you should see a poll on the screen where you click a button to choose your answer. And it's, you know, I don't know if you meant to say you were specifically 5.25. I didn't even know that level of detail. I just wanted to know of those versions, 6.5.4.3 or earlier, or 6.2.2, the latest. Actually, when I wrote that, 6.2.2 was the latest. Now it's 6.2.3. Okay, so again, thanks everybody for your answer. Close that poll. And then finally, just curious, what major feature of FusionReactor do you find that you use every day? And this is a multiple choice question, so I would like you to pick what major features, hopefully, that you use, but if you do only use one, then just answer one. Okay, I'll give you about 5 more seconds to answer. Because it's not critical. If you didn't get to answer everyone, that's okay. But it falls in line in about the order that you see it presented on the screen. Actually, in this presentation, we have more people using the crash protection email alerts stack traces. So other than that, it's in about the order that I would expect. So thank you for that. Okay, that's good to know. Alrighty, so let's move on. So who does this talk apply to? And is anybody interested in troubleshooting or tuning their servers and solving coding issues? And FusionReactor can be used for both kinds of things. And it's important to know that it can be used for both kinds of things. Some people think it's only for one and it's really for the other, and vice versa. It's really great for both. Whether you're an administrator, a manager, a developer, in DevOps, there's a place for FusionReactor in your toolkit in all of these places. For instance, you know, managers, you might think, well, they don't want to sit there and watch the screen. No, but there are daily reports that could be sent, and those daily reports can let the manager know how the server's doing every day. And it's also applying to you regardless of what CFML engine you use. So whether you're on ColdFusion, Lucy, Rilo, Blue Dragon, FusionReactor works on all of them. That's a surprise. A lot of people don't know that. Yes, it works with all of the CFML engines. And if you didn't know there were many, yes, there are. Then also, maybe you don't use ColdFusion at all. Maybe you use a Java application server. And it works with any Java application server, Tomcat, JBoss, Wildfly, Jetty, WebSphere, you name it. It works with them. Yes, it does. And any Java application, whether you know if you've got Solar, like with ColdFusion, you get Solar, you could use FusionReactor to monitor the Solar instance. If you have a application like Confluence that you bought and have installed, or anything at all that's a big Java application that you might want to monitor, you can use FusionReactor to monitor that. And by the way, let me say too that the license of FusionReactor is per box. So if you had multiples of these things on one box, your one license would monitor all of those that are on that one box. So really good. And it's implemented simply as a Java agent. That's why it's so easy to implement in any Java application, if you didn't know that. And it's also low cost, low impact, and reliable. So I love it. I use it every day, help people use it every day. And it's been trusted for 10 years by thousands of shops worldwide, and recently sold its 25,000th license. So it's no newcomer. It may be new to some of you, but it's been around for a long time, and it just gets better and better. I don't always say every year, it gets better every month. There's updates just about every month that make it better and better. So quickly, who am I? I don't work for Integral, the company that makes FusionReactor. I'm an independent consultant, and I just focus primarily on CF server troubleshooting, but I also work with people that use Rilo and Lucy and Java application servers. And I also serve clients through my own consulting, have done that for 10 years at carehart.org. I also do consulting through Integral, the makers of FusionReactor, through their website called CF Consultant. So I help people however they come to me. I just want to help. I want to solve problems. I also provide the FusionReactor training and do also provide occasional assistance in FusionReactor support. They have excellent engineers, and they're much better at a lot of things. So definitely I'm really glad they're there as the primary means of support. But sometimes there's some practical aspects of using it that I can help with, because I do help people use it all the time. Okay, so I also want to say before we go on that this is going to be about hidden gems, but there's some things that you should already know about. It can monitor your CFML or Java application server. It can track every request and the details about each one. It can track every query and the details about each one. It offers information about heap use and CPU and much, much more. We're going to see some things even related to some of those where you go, oh, I didn't know it did that. And folks tend to focus on slow requests and queries and high CPU memory, and it's great and helpful for that. It can help you to see when it's happening and where it's happening. Sometimes folks are left wondering why, and with the right features within FusionReactor, you can often know why with just a little bit of effort. Now, some of those features are ones that I'm not going to talk about today because you should already know about these things. They're covered in fast track training. They're covered in the docs, covered in feature pages and videos and so on. But I just want to say you should know already, I hope, and if not, go find out how to use the stack tracing feature of FusionReactor. That'll help you identify the line of code that's running when a request is running, right down to the line of code. Really powerful. You should know about crash protection alerts, and not just to be notified that there's a problem. I know you know there's a problem, but they'll tell you tremendously useful information sent to you by email at the time of the hang-up, such as what requests are running and how long have they been running, from what IP address, and they have the stack trace of every running request. So it's great. It's gold, literally gold. I call it gold. And then there's logs, and I love FusionReactor's logs. They track nearly everything that FusionReactor tracks, but they track it over time, including prior to a restart. So the logs are awesome. You should know how to take full advantage of the logs. And they're self-managed, so they don't take up a lot of space, and they're high speed, so they don't have a lot of impact. So they're great, really great. And then finally, I think it was FusionReactor 5 that added end-user performance monitoring, and that's tracking the time that's spent getting from the server to the client and back and forth, and that can be really valuable for some of you for some problems you might want to solve. So again, you can look into those things in the docs, and I'll talk later about where the docs are if you don't know, because it's all there, and you can learn more about those. But let's move on to the hidden gems. Just a second, somebody said as a question, is there any documentation on how to implement FusionReactor on Lucy? Well, yes, there's an installation guide, and the installation guide talks about implementing FusionReactor in every operating system and in every supported engine, whether CFML or Java. So, again, I just said, I know you wrote this before I said this, but I'm going to point you later to the docs because some people don't know about them, or just do FusionReactor documentation in Google, and you'll find it. But the point is, yes, there is documentation. There's an installation guide. There's a user guide. There's many guides. And you should definitely be able to find your answer to that question. Okay, so first I want to talk about gems that are hidden in plain sight. And we'll go back and forth between looking at slides and looking at demos. But first, you may have noticed that there's metrics, web metrics, and I'll just show you that real quick on my server. This is a view of my own server, and this is the metrics, web metrics page, and I'm sure all of you have seen this before for your own servers. But beyond knowing that it's there, did you know that it shows how long your instance has been up? A lot of people miss that. They focus on these graphs, and depending on your resolution, that may be all you see. In my current resolution, that's all I see. And I've just done a Control-0 on my browser, so it's zoomed out, and that's at my resolution. That's what I see. But if I scroll down below the charts, there's all this text, and really important thing is to see uptime. Now, I think it's unfortunate that the phrase there is server uptime. It's not server uptime. It's your instance's uptime. Maybe someday that'll be fixed. I hope it would be. But anyway, my instance has been up for 3 days, and usually it'd be up for 30 days. I just had some Windows updates over the weekend, so I had to reboot the box. And that's the way it should be. If any of you have your servers or a CF instance or Java instance, whatever, Lucy, going down every day, that should not be. If it's going down every week, or you feel like you have to restart it at least once a day or once a week, that should not be. It should be able to stay up for days and days and days. And again, FusionReactor can help you get to the bottom of why it's not staying up. Another thing that the metrics web metrics page shows, which people often miss, is a count of requests by status code. So down here on the bottom right corner is a count of requests by status code. And for the number of days it's been up, 3 days, I've had 30,000 requests. Mine's a lightly loaded server. You might have 30,000 in an hour, but anyway, I had 30,000 in a day. I also have some caching in front of my server, so I don't get all the requests that come to the server. Some of them are served up by the caching solution that I have. But anyway, so there's been that many that were 200s. There's been that many 302s, and 302s are just CF locations if you're a CFML developer, or location dot redirect. I forget the underlying Java equivalent, but there's redirects in Java as well. So those are just redirects, nothing wrong there. And I've had some 400s, some 403s, 404s, 500s, 503s, and 504s. Another cool thing that people don't notice is that if you ever see something in blue, that means it's a link. So if I wanted to see what were my 500 internal server errors, I could click on that, and I'm taken to a page that shows me. Sorry, I'm clicking the link. There you go. And it takes me to a page that shows me those, in my case, 500 errors, and it shows me when they happened. And if you'd had, 50 of them on the page, then this graph would be full of 50 indications of time when they happened. Perhaps many happened in the same time frame, so you'd see some pattern perhaps, or they cluster around some time. But anyway, the point is I can see what requests got a 500 error, and I see this. I don't know, it's interesting, somebody calling this Portlet CFC method equals X, maybe trying to see what would happen if they tried to hit it. And so another thing, which again, we may not get in too much detail because I hope you already know this, is you can click on any request, and now I'm seeing the details for that request, not for just all for that URL, but that specific request at that particular time that got that particular error message from that particular IP address. And there's all kinds of details down here. And again, I don't have time to get into all these details, but I want to show you that when you have an error, there's an error details tab. Many people never notice that. And in that errors detail tab, you're taken to the Java stack trace that happened at the end of the request. And so I see it's some sort of a null pointer exception. In time, I'm not going to try to figure this out, but it looks like it was in some process of processing that page. I can see that it says method equals X, and that's not a method that exists. I'm looking down here to see if I see a reference to Cold Fusion. I don't. So I think this is more of a, because it was a call to a CFC, the underlying CFML engine was trying to locate that CFC and then call that method, and the CFML engine crapped out because it asked for a method that didn't exist. And I'm not going to worry about that because it was only once. And let me just show you too. I might go, okay, well, I don't recognize that IP address, but how about what's the user agent? So if I go to headers and look at the user agent, okay, it was HackMyCF, duh. All right, so HackMyCF, really great tool from Pete Freitag and Foundeo, and you should definitely look into it if you're a CFML shop. And it can send bad requests to your server trying to break in, and if he is able to, he'll say, hey, this is a vulnerability you should be aware of. So I'm assuming that he got what he should get, and he because I get his reports, and they're always clean. So that's what that is. But there's a helpful point for you to know that you can also look at the headers, look at the user agent, and see what kind of thing made a request to your server. Okay. And then there's also request by response code. So if I come over here to the top left corner and go to requests response codes, it's a slightly different way to get to that information we were just looking at. It's that same list of the request that had a particular status code, and in the top right corner I could change and say, well, let me focus on what got 404s. And now asking for URLs that don't exist, and I could maybe find out that it's they made a mistake or I've made a mistake, but the point is all that information is there, and there you can start to see the time frames when they happened. I'll leave you look into that more on your own. Now, another thing, back to the metrics, web metrics, that people don't often notice is that up at the top where those graphs are, you've perhaps looked at those graphs. I'm just hitting the back button a few times to get to it. And you can do that. It's in FusionReactor 5 and above. It's just HTML, so you can back up just like in any web application. And I thought that would be faster, but there you go. So here's the graphs up at the top, and I want you to know that besides looking at these graphs, and you may hopefully have noticed that you can look at the last hour as well as the last minute, but what if the last day or the last week? Well, that's not offered here, but under every one of these graphs, there's a link, and many people don't notice that's a link. If you mouse over it, you can see it's a link. You can see the finger pop up there, and if I click on it, it takes me to a larger graph about that thing. So this is my request activity graph. Now it's the larger graph of the request activity graph, and now I can look back at an hour, at a day, at a week. So that's great. And you can also change what's graphed. So if I go back to the metrics web metrics page, so here I am looking at these metrics web metrics. In the top right corner, I could say I'd like to focus on something else besides whatever's on this graph. So I want you to make sure you saw what I did. In the top right corner of the 6 graphs, each graph has a top right corner. So in the top right corner of this graph, I'm choosing to modify it. And what you can do is add a new series. So down here it says add series. I'm going to click add series and put in some new value. And if you click on this button, there's all kinds of stuff that gets tracked, just all kinds of stuff. And I'll leave you look into that on your own. But I'd like to see how many sessions I have. So active sessions total, and I'll change the color to look a little bit different. And then I'll save it. And now I'm going to see added to that graph. That's fine. I don't know why the color didn't pick up, but there's sessions right there. So I might have missed clicking a button to save the color. But the point is that down there is sessions. You can see it says active sessions 132. And so I can now see my tracking of sessions across time. Now, be aware that when you add something to the graph like this, if you picked something that has a dramatically different number than the rest, like if I had added my sessions over here to this tracking of request activity, well, that 132 would make this graph, be showing 132, and these other numbers would be so tiny I wouldn't be able to see them. So do keep in mind that if you're going to add things to a graph that has other things, they need to have somewhat similar values. Like down here, these are two different values of CPU, instant CPU and system CPU, and they both can fit nicely on a graph. The memory here is 3 different kinds of memory. They all fit nicely on a graph. So just be aware of that. Finally, I want to show you that, let's say you looked at that and you go, yeah, I didn't like that. Well, you can always come back in and either modify it. I could have corrected that color, or I want you to see that I can just say, hey, put it all back to normal. So I don't think another screen is open. I've never seen it hang up like this. I don't know what's going on. Apologize for that. It's not normal. I'm just going to go ahead and refresh the page. Oh, there it was. It finally popped up. So I want you to see that there's a button there that says Reset Graph Default. So here's the third one that I had added. I can just set it all back to normal. And now I'm back to the way it was. Very good. Okay. All right, now before I go on, I think I saw a question. Clicking on requests that finish with 200, I want to see the top few. Is there a way to scroll through them all in the history? Well, again, that's kind of with all these request things, like if I look at request history, by default, it's the 100 most recent requests that happened. If I look at requests, longest request, it's the 100 longest running requests since, in my case, Cold Fusion has come up. So by default, they're all set to 100. And then when you looked at request by response codes, that too is the top 100 most recent requests, in this case, that had 200. You said you only saw a few. You should see 100 if it's 200. So, hopefully everything's happening as a 200 except for some things. So that's that. And as far as configuring that, that's up here under requests settings. And, like I told you, there's a lot of things I could talk about in this class, but I had to pick some things, and I'm trying to pick things that I think might be more helpful and useful for more people. But anyway, there's the history size right there. Okay, so you can tweak those things: request settings and then request history. All right, let's move on. Did you know that you can click on any element of the legend of any element in a graph, and you can hide that data? So if I go back to the metrics, web metrics, not that you'd want to do this, but let's say we, for some reason, thought to do this. I don't want to see the heap use. I can just click on that, and boom, heap use is gone. I don't want to see the system CPU. Boom, it's gone. Now, by the way, I have really high system CPU and very low CF, in my case, CPU. So something on my box is using a lot of CPU. And that's something I probably ought to explore. It's unusual. I don't know what it is. It could be anything. It could be a virus scan running in the background, security scan. So anyway, I'm not going to investigate that right now. But the point is I can easily add things to the graphs by just clicking on those buttons. And as soon as I refresh the page, I believe we'll find that it should go back to the default values. Yep. So there you go. Yep, they're back. Yep, there you go. All right. And most pages have a clear history button. So like when we were looking at those 100 most recent requests, that may not be so useful. But let's say I was looking at the 100 longest requests. Let's say I just restarted my instance and I come into the 100 longest requests, this longest request page. And you guys probably all know that when you first restart your instance, most early requests are going to be slow for various reasons, things getting fired up, frameworks being loaded, objects being loaded into memory. You may find that in the first few minutes there are many slow requests, but you go, I don't care about those first few requests. I want to get rid of them. I don't want them showing up later as having impacted my server. I want to focus on what really was slow once life was underway. Well, there's a clear history button, and it would at that moment clear whatever's in that history. So I'm not going to do it now because I want to take advantage of these because they're from later in the life. And you can tell when they were in the life of the request because this ID column, every request in CF or whatever your server engine is, every request that comes in gets an ID. Every CFM in case of Cold Fusion gets, or CFC gets that's requested by a browser, gets an ID. So I can see this was an early one, 257. These are later ones, 10,000 and 18,000. So anyway, let's move on. You can also select any page to be the home page. So if I just come to the FusionReactor site, and we'll talk about this funny looking URL if it's funny looking to you. We'll come back to that in a moment. Sorry, one too far. If I just came into FusionReactor without telling it where to go, the question is, where would it go? And that's what the home page feature in FusionReactor is about. And that slowness, I'm now starting to think, is whatever this high CPU is on my box, it's making everything slow. It's not Cold Fusion, it's not FusionReactor, it's something else on my box. And that's unfortunate. I didn't notice that before we got started. I could have gone and addressed it. But anyway, I'm going to move on. So this home page button. You can pick any page you want. If you like to look at the request activity, I know some people prefer to watch that, you can make that be the home page. And all it is that when you come into FusionReactor and you don't tell it where to go, then that's where it's going to go by default. But you've also perhaps noticed up here that every page does have a URL. And so I could bookmark that page and click a link and go to that page. So the home page is if you don't tell it where to go, but otherwise you absolutely can tell it where you want it to go. And it's a responsive and adaptive UI. I'm going to change this from being maximized, where we can see the buttons on the left. I'm going to change it to not be maximized. And eventually, as I make it narrower and narrower, watch on the left, you're going to see that menu eventually pop up out of the way. There you go. And now it's up here under this menu interface instead. So again, just an adaptive UI, helpful when you're looking at small devices, phones, tablets. And then finally, I've mentioned that there's online help. So here, let's see how to get to that. So up in the top left corner, you go to FusionReactor, the very top left corner, there's a FusionReactor logo. That is a menu. And under that menu is many things, one of which is help. And when you click that, it opens a new tab in your browser by default, and it goes to the website where the docs are. And it goes for the version you're using. So I'm looking at 6.2's versions of the docs. And here again, like I said, there's an installation guide, a user's guide, and then many other guides for various aspects of using FusionReactor. So again, I'm not going to get into everything in FusionReactor. You've got to come back and look at those guides, and you'll maybe be amazed at what's going on there. Now I see somebody else asked another question. Does FusionReactor properly handle huge request sizes? I would likely need somewhere in the size of 10,000 to 100,000. So Kai, I think you're saying you would like on this request history page to be able to see the 100,000 most recent requests, to which I will say, do not do that. No, do not do that. I don't think FusionReactor will be able to handle that. And that's not a limitation of FusionReactor. It's that stop and think. Why would you want to look at the 100,000 most recent requests that have happened? I think you're misunderstanding a couple things. First of all, that's going to take a long time to render in the browser. Even if there was no issue on the server, showing 100,000 lines in the browser, well, you might say, well, how about a page interface? Okay, it doesn't do that. It doesn't have a page interface. It's not designed to look at that. You could argue that it could be, but let's just right now say, no, it doesn't. So that's one thing. But second, if you're interested in looking at a request 100,000 requests ago, I had said back at the beginning of the presentation that there are logs, and that would be where you should go to look at something 10,000 or 100,000 requests ago. And I know that may not be what you hoped to hear. You want to see it in an interface. Here's the thing you have to understand, and I don't have time in this class to get into it in depth, but this FusionReactor is running inside your JVM. I think you're perhaps used to other environments where the monitoring tool runs outside of the environment and it's storing all its stuff in a database. FusionReactor is not doing that. FusionReactor has all its information in the memory of the instance you're monitoring. And I know that will be a bit of a shock to some people, but that is the way it works. And there's benefit to it running in the JVM. I said earlier, it's implemented as a Java agent. That's the implication of that is FusionReactor runs inside the JVM, and it gets access to great information because it's inside the JVM. But because it's inside the JVM, the presumption is that it tends to not show very far back in the history. It focuses on big things like long requests and slow requests and things like that. But if you want to see just a random thing on 10,000 requests ago, this is not the place to look for it. Now, first of all, you could look at the logs. Second, There is an alternative tool called Fusion Analytics. Some of you know about that. It's a separate tool to FusionReactor, and it runs on another server. Typically, you would install on another server, and it would read the logs from FusionReactor, and it would store the data in a database, and it would provide an interface where, yes, you could look at a request 10,000 requests ago. So that's really Fusion Analytics' role if you want to do that. And then finally, I'll throw out there, don't forget, many of you can just find it in the logs, but I want to say also that there's an upcoming new implementation of FusionReactor called FusionReactor Cloud, or in the cloud, and there'll be more to say about that in time. But that will instead not run inside the JVM. Well, part of it will, but part of it will run in a cloud server that Integral will make for you and provide for you, and they'll have a database that they track and keep for you, and they'll store most of this data in the database, and that will allow you to look back at history. So that's going to be maybe where you'll get what you want, Kai. But no, to be clear right now, the way FusionReactor is implemented, you would not look at the history of 10,000 requests ago. And don't do it. I mean, yes, you could change it, but don't do it. I think most people would find if they started to make it more than about 300, they would find coming to this page would get slower and slower. Part of it's because it's gathering up a lot of information every time you go to it. Part of it's because it's rendering that information in the browser, and it's just not designed for showing large amounts of data. So just don't do it. I wouldn't recommend you do it. Hope that's helpful. Okay. So I mentioned that you could see the heap. A lot of people know about using FusionReactor to track the heap. Here up in Metrics, Web Metrics, you can see the heap in the top right corner. But what about other parts of the memory? What about, for instance, the permgen if you're on Java 7 and earlier, or the meta space if you're on Java 8 and above? That's not tracked up here. And for some people, that's their problem, and they ought to be paying attention to it. Well, over here on the bottom left, you can go to Resources, and first that you can focus on the heap. That would be that graph in the larger form. You can focus on something that shows the heap versus the non-heap, and that might be interesting to see. In this case, the non-heap plus the heap, in my case, is 700 meg, and the non-heap is 258. That means, therefore, the difference between the two is about 500, almost 450. So there I can see how much is heap, how much is non-heap. But better than that, if you really want to get into it, is you go to memory spaces. Memory spaces. So resources, memory spaces. And it starts out also looking like, that's just the graph of the heap, but it's not. The color's the same, but it's not. This is looking at the Eden space, which is the recently allocated objects. And yep, I can go up here in the top right corner and change it to look at the old gen. That's long-lived Java objects for those that really want to geek out on things like this. It's usually not that interesting, and in my case, my old gen is always really jacked up because I got some long-lived objects, and that just is what it is. But the meta space might be interesting. I'm in Java 8, so there's my meta space, and sometimes that might be interesting to see. And remember, with all these graphs, you can watch them over time, and maybe you'll see it fluctuates during the day or during the week, but in my case, it barely is fluctuating. But the point is, yes, you can go explore that to your heart's content. So enjoy. Now, back to memory. If we go back to the metrics, web metrics, some of you maybe noticed this, maybe you're afraid to touch it, but up here on the top right, under all the graphs, to the right of this last hour button, there's a garbage collection. So here's the memory graph, and it says I'm currently using about 480 meg of memory. But that's just the JVM after it's done a minor garbage collection. It's only gone down to about 430, and then it's risen up to about 480, and now it just fell down again on its own to about 430. Okay, so that's the used, quote, used memory. But that doesn't mean it's really in use. It means it has been used, and the JVM has not tried to garbage collect it, because these again are minor GCs. It hasn't tried to do a major GC, and it will. We don't need to babysit this. Trust me, don't overfocus on this. But let's say you see that, and in my case, you might be surprised to think, yeah, I run my server at 750 meg of heap, and it runs fine, because I've taken care of problems, and it can run at 750 meg of heap. And currently it's used in 480-ish of that, and it's about to go down again. But I don't think it's really using 480 meg, and I'll prove it by clicking on garbage collection. And that's going to do what's called a major GC. It's going to go look through those old objects and say, hey, any of you old objects no longer really in use? And it said, yeah, there's a bunch of us that are no longer in use, and in a moment we'll see that graph will drop. There you go. So it thought that it was using almost 500 meg of heap, but no, but really was only using 250 meg. So let me be clear. This is just telling me that while it said it was in use, it wasn't really in use. And if you do that button and it doesn't drop much, then it just says, no, it really is in use. And that's another subject of why the memory is in use. We don't have time to get into that in great depth here. Again, that's not the focus of this presentation. There is also, if you want to focus on have garbage collections happen and how long have they taken and when have they happened, then that's also available down here under Resources, Garbage Collection. Resources, Garbage Collection. And I can watch historically when minor and major garbage collections have happened. And you know, we just did one, so there's one. The Mark Sweep is a major GC, and that just happened, and it took about 5 seconds to do its thing. So yeah, for 5 seconds everything maybe got held up, but that's all, 5 seconds to do that. It might have been worthwhile. And now it's already gone because it happened over a minute ago. If I want to go back and look over time, I can go to these graphs and see how it's looked over the course of a day and a week, and we'll see that throughout the day there's probably occasional major GCs. There you go. So they're happening every once in a while. And again, it's usually, this is not a problem. It's usually not a focus of attention. I know some people think it's the most important thing in the world. You'll know if it is, because if you can't find the answer somewhere else, maybe it's this, but almost always the answer is somewhere else. This is GC algorithms and how often the server's doing GCs is usually not the cause of your problem. Trust me, that's my experience. Okay. And the scavenge are the minor GCs. And they show how often they happen and how long they take. And it's all logged. I've said about there's a specific log for garbage collection. So if you think before a crash that your problem was garbage collection, well, you can prove it. Go back to the logs in FusionReactor's logs in the archive on the day that you had a crash, in the hour before you had the crash. You could look at the log, and there's a GC PS Mark Sweep log that tracks the major GCs. And there's just a number that says, just like that graph, it's the same data that's graphed. It's in the given 5 second window, it's every 5 seconds, how many happened and how long did they take on average. So that's great stuff. All right, so I'm going to check back, see some questions. Does FusionReactor have the ability to do heap dumps? No, FusionReactor does not have the ability to do heap dumps. No, it doesn't. It'd be nice. It's a good point. I don't know why they don't. You might ask whether they could consider adding that. It's funny, I've never thought about that. It could be useful, sure. And again, ask that of the engineers. Send an email to sales@fusion-reactor.com, and that will get routed to the engineers, and they'll offer their explanation for why they don't. Anyway, and back to Kai's question, he'd like to recognize and see the patterns when huge volumes of 500 errors occur. Our application has high request volumes, multiple thousands every hour. Well, again, you won't really want to use that interface for tracking that. What you could do, and again, this class I don't get into it, but with those logs, you could import them into a spreadsheet and very easily see such a pattern. So if you come up here to the docs and you just type in Excel, and whether you use Excel or OpenOffice Calc, doesn't matter, just type Excel in the docs, and it takes you to a page in the docs, and this is over the web across the pond to Europe, where some of you are, because we did this in the US morning, so some of you in Europe could see this in your afternoon. But there you go. So here's importing and graphing data in Excel. And it's just a single page that talks about how to import the various logs. It doesn't matter about that list, but here's how to import a log into Excel. And it's real simple. The key point is that you say it's a space delimited file. Whether you use an OpenOffice Calc or Excel, when you open the log, it'll prompt you to go through a process of importing it, and you want to say it's a space delimited column, and then boom, you'll see it filled with the columns. And the docs, FusionReactor has docs on every log, and I'll just show you that really quick under FusionReactor User Guide, Logging, overview of, logs available in FusionReactor, and there's a list of all the logs that are in FusionReactor. And so he was talking about the request log and the status code 500, so he could come and look at the docs for the request log and see. Come on, wake up. He could see that the status code is, that's not that status 20, column 20, or T. See, if you import it into a spreadsheet, column T will have that. All right, and it tells you status code, and you can do filtering on it and do all that sort of cool stuff. So that's great. See, another question: is there a web API to pull and view enterprise dashboard or web metrics with some kind of heads-up display? Yes, there is an API, FusionReactor API. If you just come up here into the docs and say API, you should find the discussions, plural, of the FusionReactor API. Okay, let's move back to the presentation. Now, somebody just asked if you can get a thread dump, and I said, no, you can't get a thread dump, but you can get a stack trace. So if you have a long-running request and you wonder what it's doing, sometimes it's helpful to do a stack trace. So I'm going to do something real quick to take 20 seconds. Okay, and while it's running, I'm going to come back to FusionReactor requests activity. And maybe I didn't take, okay. There you go. Now it's running. And I'll refresh this page. And there's a request running, and it's a request that turns around and does a CF HTTP call to a CFC. But the point is, I maybe wouldn't know that, and so if I click this stack trace button and said, hey, what are you doing? Well, I happen to just miss it finishing, and explaining it, I missed it. So I'm just going to refresh the page and come back and catch it again. So there it is, only 2 seconds old, and I'm going to stack trace this guy and say, hey, what are you doing? And at the moment I said, hey, what are you doing? He comes back with this Java information, the Java methods that are being called. Like I said, remember, my server's got some problem where there's 100% CPU because of something not in ColdFusion. So I don't know why. I don't have time right now to go solve that. I'm tempted because I don't want to be held up waiting for this. Yeah, so by the time it did it, it was already gone. Anyway, I was going to move on. You may know that you can get a stack trace, but did you know you could do stack trace all? And sometimes that's helpful in a scenario like I just did, where you just want to say, hey, look, I don't want to try to catch each one. I just want to stack trace every running request. Well, under resources, threads, this shows me a list of all the threads in the JVM, all of them, whether they're running CF requests in ColdFusion or not. And there's all kinds of ones in there that have nothing to do with ColdFusion, things that you don't even recognize, but that's not the point. The point is, among these, there will be threads that are doing requests, like in the case of ColdFusion 10 and above, the requests that do CFML page requests are called AJP, blah, 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 AJP, blah, 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 exec some number. And there's one for every request that either is running or has run, and those threads live for a little while before they're collected. Well, up at the top, if I wanted to, I could stack trace all these guys. If I needed to watch everything, I could do a stack trace all, and it just sends a request and says, hey, give me the stack trace of every running request, and in a moment it's going to show up on the screen. Boom, there they are. And as I page down, I can see everyone. And sometimes that may be useful. Okay? I don't have time to get into why that's useful. I'm going to move on. We're down to 15 minutes left. When you have a long-running request, again, I'll crank this up to be really long, like 60 seconds. And then I'll come over here to the request let's say the request activity. Also, the metrics, web metrics, both of them are going to show that there's this request that's running. In the case of the metrics, web metrics, it shows it running by having a light blue graph in the top left corner. Come on, wake up. There you go. This light blue rising thing is telling me this request is still running, still running. Well, there's a button over here that says stop tracking. If I click on that request to say stop tracking it, it immediately does not apply to that graph anymore. We'll see that graph go right down. Unfortunately, it's taking so long to get there that we probably won't see it. It will have just ended on its own. But the point is, if you had been sitting there with something that was running for like 1,000,000 milliseconds, and it's making this graph just so big and you don't see anything else ever running, you could say stop tracking. It stops affecting this graph. It would stop affecting any queries being run, so that's what these graphs are about. So it just stops the graphs from reflecting the impact of that request. The request is still there. Now, in my case, it's finished. But if it were a 1,000,000 millisecond long-running request, it would still be there, but it would have a phrase over here that said it had been stopped tracking. So it's still listed, still running, but it's not affecting the metrics. It's also not affecting crash protection alerts, which is really nice. So if you're getting crash protection alerts over and over, and it's a request that either you already understand why it's slow or you accept that there's nothing you can do about it, you could go stop tracking those requests that you know you can't do anything about, and the alerts will stop, at least until, like if you said, tell me when there's 20 slow running requests, then the next time there's more 20 more slow running requests, then you start getting them again. And at some point you're going to have to address the problem, but the point is sometimes telling it to stop tracking can be very helpful. And you may notice that there's an option to kill requests, but just beware, you can't kill a request that's waiting for something outside the JVM. So if it's, and this is important, if a CF page is waiting for a query, if it's waiting for a CF HTTP or the equivalent HTTP client in Java, it's doing a file, whatever. If it's waiting for something outside of ColdFusion, outside of your CFM, your engine, CFML engine, or your Java server, if it's something that the OS is responsible to go do, sends a request off to someplace else, you can't kill it. And that's not a bug in your CFML or Java engine. It's not a bug in FusionReactor. It's just the way the JVM is. When a request goes out to talk to something, it puts the thread in what's called a native method, usually in a socket read method, and it just waits for a response thing outside, and you can't kill it while it's in that state. So unfortunately, sometimes you cannot kill them. All you can do is try to find out what the real root cause is and make it go away. You can kill requests, though, if they're doing other things, if they're like looping through code or going from line to line in some slow process. Like on my server right now, with things being slow, I'm sure I could kill some requests that showed being slow, and they're just being slow because everything's slow on the machine. Now, that's not the answer. I got to figure out why everything's slow on the machine, and that's the kind of stuff you have to keep in your head. Sometimes there's a bigger explanation for why you see things being slow. It's not your CFML engine. It's not your code. It may not even be the database. It may be something on your server that's impacting CF, in my case CF, and it's making it slow. It's not CF's fault. It's something else on the box. And as I say here, there's other features of the user interface, of FusionReactor, either the user interface, the logs, or the alerts, that can help you really solve such problems. And this is not a presentation on how to solve problems with FusionReactor. Remember, it's just hidden gems. So you can track things by application. Most of the requests have the option to track things by application. So if I look right here at running requests, it's by default looking at all applications. I could have said, well, only show me the things of a certain application. It will make more sense if I look at like my longest requests. So this is the 100 longest requests that have ever happened. And we can see that some are from my blog, some are from my wiki. I could say, just show me the ones for my wiki. I know that the thing that says CF911 wiki is this application called Canvas Wiki. And boom, I'm just focusing now on, listen, of the 100 that were slow, these were the ones that were Canvas Wiki. It doesn't give me 100 that were Canvas Wiki. It's of the 100 that were longest running. These are the ones that are Canvas Wiki, and the blog would be some other number, and the sum of all those will add up to 100. And that can help you isolate if issues are unique per application. And that app name is determined automatically, or it can be set programmatically. And I've mentioned the logs several times. Nearly everything in FusionReactor is logged. Check it out. They're in the file system. The current hour is in your FusionReactor folder under instance, then your instance name, and then log. But listen, the other hours are not under log. People often miss that. They're under archive. So you go to the archive folder, and then in that archive folder, there's a folder for each day, and then there's a zipped up file for each hour, and that's created at the top of each hour by default, or when you restart the instance, a zip is created at that moment. And they're kept for 30 days by default, and FusionReactor automatically manages that. And I've mentioned the documentation of the log columns, and here again is that specific place to find it. I just went there because we were talking about something where it made sense. Okay. Also about the logs, you can export them from the archives. In FusionReactor 6, by default, you can come down here to this archive, log archive, and you're now seeing a display of what's in that file system. Here are, for today, my logs at 9 a.m., 8 a.m., 7 a.m., 6 a.m. I can click on this link and download that zip to my local machine. So if you don't have access to the server to look at the logs, yes, as a FusionReactor 6, you can just go get them. And by the way, in FusionReactor 5, you can enable it. It's just a configurable option. And I'll leave you to look in the docs for that. Or send an email to support or sales, and they can help you. And I mentioned the imported logs, and there's the help for that. And I mentioned Fusion Analytics, and you can learn more about that. Okay, and we've talked about the longest requests, and slowest request is the 100 most recent slow requests. So I'm talking about differences that you may not notice. Many people know about the longest requests, but they don't pay attention to the fact that besides longest, which is the 100 longest since your engine came up, you can also say, just show me the 100 most recent that were slow. So slow requests is the 100 most recent. So this is not in order of duration. There's 20.1, 20.4, 20.2. It's in order of recency, 942, 22, 22, 941, 52, 52. So these are the ones I just ran. But the point is, it's helpful sometimes to look at what's been slow recently. And in fact, sometimes it helps to look at your clock and go, what time is it? And then look at when was the most recent slow request. And you may find that the most recent slow request was hours ago. And you go, whew, server's been doing good. We haven't had a slow request in hours. Now, slow is defined in FusionReactor as 8 seconds for requests. And that's configurable up there under the requests settings. You can change what is considered slow. But that's a really helpful thing. And then our JDBC, some of you know about the JDBC section that focuses on queries, and there's JDBC longest transactions and JDBC slow transactions as well. So you're just looking at the 100 most recent queries that were slow, and you see the SQL and the duration. And then let me just tell you real quickly, if you're ever looking at any of these JDBC things, and you want to know, well, what request was that? Well, I click on the request. If I go to on this query, so now I'm looking at a query. If I want to know what request did it run, and I go to relations, and then this is the request that ran in. This is the web request that query ran in, and I could go here now to the details of that request, of which that query was one of the slow queries. And there it is, among others that were slow that day and time for some reason. And there's JDBC stuff, and there's a transaction thing, and the transaction button over here just includes other things. It includes, let me just show you, for instance, the history. When I go to transactions history, it starts out looking at just web requests, and that's not useful because you can go to requests, but I could also go to JDBC, but you can also go to JDBC to get that. But look at what the other things you can see, like HTTP client or CFHTTP. So you can say, I want to focus on the most recent slow CFHTTP calls, and there's the ones that I did as a part of my little demo there. But this is of the most 100 recent slow transactions, which ones were CFHTTPs. So yeah, check that out. And there's also metrics, web metrics versus metrics. Some people often wonder, what's the difference between those two things? Well, part of the difference is that if I go to metrics, it looks the same. But again, up here at the top, I can focus on different things. Like I can say, only show me my CFHTTPs that have happened. I just want to focus on CFHTTPs that have happened. And there hadn't been any recently, so they're not showing up in that top left graph. But more important, notice down here, here's details about things that have done CFHTTPs. Are there any currently running? Are there any in history? How many? What have been their average response time? So you can see things also about CFHTTPs, currently running ones, and recent performance average. So that's another helpful thing about the metrics. And some things you might want to enable, user agent logging, and we're about to run out of time, so I'm just going to go through these things really quickly. You can enable user agent logging in request settings, request logging, and it will log in your logs, in the request log, the user agent of every request. And you can also enable them in your alerts, in your FusionReactor crash protection alerts. Go to protection settings, email settings, and you'll see an option to enable user agent display in the alerts. And there's more settings about setting up alerts. If you want to get alerts and daily reports, you go to the FusionReactor logo in the top left corner, then go to settings, email settings, and you can fill in who should get the email and what mail server should it go through. And you can put multiple addresses separated by commas. And you might even find you can send it from a name that doesn't exist. Your mail server may let you do that, and that can be helpful for setting up rules. Okay, and then there's a test email button to try that. If you're behind a load balancer, you may find that FusionReactor always shows the IP address of the load balancer, where you can change that in request settings proxy. You can point to what the the header is, and it might be real IP or exported for, that sort of thing. And you can find the headers, just like I showed you when we looked at the request details. In the headers tab, there would have been a display of what headers were passed in, and if you're seeing everything have the same IP address, then in a given request's details in the headers tab, you'll see there's probably some header, maybe called exported for, maybe called real IP, and you take whatever the name of that is and you go back into request settings proxy and you either pick or put in that header name, and now FusionReactor will look at that header to get the real IP address. Okay. And there's some tweaks that you might want to consider. You can bookmark any page. I mentioned that earlier. You can copy the shortcut created on the Fram desktop and point it to your real FusionReactor instance instead of the Fram instance. You can access FusionReactor via an external web server by default. I was doing that. You put in your site name, and then FusionReactor, in the case of Cold Fusion, you say FusionReactor.cfm/findex.htm. Just adding that right there. If you're off the server, you may find that lets you in. And if you don't want it to, then that's something you can disable in the FusionReactor interface. And I don't have it listed there, but in the FusionReactor enable disable option in the top left corner, you can say, I don't want to allow access to through the external web server. And this was chosen when you installed FusionReactor into the instance. It was a question, and if you said yes, then it lets you get to it through an external web server. You still have to have the password, of course, and stuff like that. And there you go. There, I talked about that. I'm trying to get through this real quickly. You can see the logs online in the FusionReactor menu, then logs in the top left corner. So if I go to FusionReactor, then logs, now I can see the different logs of the current hour, and we're just about to cross over an hour threshold, so I could go to my request log and see what my most recent requests have been. Now back to whoever asked the question about how much data is shown. This too only shows by default 128K worth of the logs. So in my case, it goes back about a half hour. Some of you may only go back 2 minutes. Depends on how many requests you have. But the point is it only shows the most recent 128K. Now something new in FusionReactor 6, or one of the point releases, is a tail button. So now this is going to refresh every time that log changes. It's going to refresh the screen, and it's showing me what's been most recently requested down here at the bottom. You can't see it, but it's automatically scrolled to the bottom. And so here at the bottom, I'm seeing each request as it runs. So that's the tail feature of the FusionReactor logs display. Pretty cool stuff. And I just want to, I'll leave you two guys to read some of this stuff. We already covered that. Yeah, I'm just going to skip through this because we're almost out of time. This is important. There are several useful connection strings. By default, FusionReactor tracks every query in every data source since FusionReactor 5. Maybe you don't want it to. Well, first of all, there's an option. You could go to a given data source. In the case of CFML engines, you go to the Data Sources tab. And for the details of a given data source, there's a connection string, and you can add a connection string like underscore underscore, that's 2 underscores, underscore underscore FusionReactor underscore exclude equals true, and now it will not be monitored instantly. As soon as you put that in there, no more monitoring of that data source by FusionReactor. You can also tell it the name of the data source. It can't figure that out by itself. You can also tell it to track when a given number of queries has come back. Let's say you set it to 1,000. Then every time there's 1,000 requests for a given query, there'll be a log line in the log saying, hey, there was 1,000 requests to this data source. So, sorry, 1,000 results came back from this data source. And you can also say, it's under the JDBC log, I'll let you read about that later. Then there's a remind after, which says not only, let's say I set it to 1,000 for the notify after, I could say remind after 1,000. That means every time another 1,000 in a given query happens, I'd get a log line telling me, hey, this query is bringing back thousands of log lines. That can be helpful. You can even, sorry for the typo there, but you can even tell FusionReactor to limit how many rows get brought back into your CFML or Java engine. Yeah, it tells the driver just drop off anything beyond that row limit. And that's not usually something you want to do, but it's an option that's there. And there's still others. You can read about that in the documentation. And there's a link to that. I'm going to go ahead and skip past this stuff because we're about to run out of time. You can read about that later. I give you all the detail you need to be able to see that. These are good things, but we're out of time. There's mobile apps available for iOS, Android. They're free in their respective stores. They're for use with FusionReactor Enterprise, and you point them to the Enterprise dashboard, so just keep that in mind. And they show pretty much everything that you see in FusionReactor, which is nice. You can disable FusionReactor. Listen, you don't need to uninstall it. If you ever fear that FusionReactor is a cause of a problem, you don't need to uninstall it. You can just disable it. First of all, in the FusionReactor menu, there's an enable-disable menu, and you can disable certain things. But second, you can just go into the FusionReactor instance manager and remove FusionReactor from that instance. Or you can just go into the JVM configuration. Like in the case of ColdFusion, it's the JVM config. And you just find the Java agent and in FusionReactor 6, the agent lib that point to the particular FusionReactor folder. You just remove those arguments and restart the JVM and boom, no more FusionReactor. So you don't have to uninstall it. You can just temporarily disable it if that's helpful. You can check for updates. You should by using the FusionReactor About page, and there's a link called Check for Updates. The latest version is 6.2.3. We mentioned the API briefly. There's more about that. I mentioned the manuals. Definitely check that out. And if you ever have any trouble with FusionReactor, don't just suffer it. Send an email to support@fusion-reactor.com. The guys are great, and they want to help you. They don't want you to suffer. Don't suffer. Don't blame it without getting proof. These guys will help you, and sometimes I'll be getting involved to help you. And then there's also a Google group for FusionReactor. If you just go to Google Groups and then search for FusionReactor, or if you go to the FusionReactor website, and I've got that here, the FusionReactor website right there. And if you go to support, and if you just click on the word support, you could go to any one of those sub-menus, but if you just click on the word support, you're taken to a page that gives you, links to the tutorials, to the docs, to the docs to the Google group. There's the FusionReactor Google group. And then there's email for support and for sales. So again, avail yourself of these features to get help. Don't suffer. And there's still more gems we could identify, but again, we're out of time. I knew we'd be running out of time. I took some time to answer some questions, and that took away a couple minutes of what I wanted to focus on other things. Now remember, I'd said earlier, there is a hidden gems in FusionReactor 6, and that focuses only on what's kind of easily missed that's new in FusionReactor 6, and there's plenty. So definitely consider that. It'll be offered in about 3 weeks, I believe. You can look at the same resource where you got this one to learn more about that. And there's some new UI features you might miss. There's some lesser known aspects of the big name features, the profile and the debugger, which I might show you that you didn't know about. There's a new cool line execution time tracking feature, which is powerful but expensive, so beware, but it may be just what you need. And lots more. So we'll cover those things in that presentation. So I hope I've met my objective and that you learned a lot. There's a lot more to FusionReactor than most people realize. And even those who use it regularly often discover things that they never even knew were there. So I'll just ask real quickly as a final poll before we go to let us know what you feel about the session. And did you learn a lot? Was it valuable, or did you learn too much or too little? Or was it useful or not useful or nothing? Or was it a waste of time? And for anybody who rates it anything less than, okay, please let us know. We want to know what disappointed you. And one person did do that, so I want to know why. Was it was too fast, it was too much, too little, not enough? Just let us know. We don't want you to suffer. But thank you for everybody else who generally gave it good or great. And I'm going to go ahead and skip on. So remember, the recording links will be shared to those who'd registered. And this will be repeated. It's planned to be monthly for now, so we'll probably do this again in November. And then eventually we'll do the FusionReactor 1 once, and then the FusionReactor 6 one another time. So we'll see those rotating over time. And again, we definitely welcome your feedback. We want to hear back from you or about other sessions you may be interested in. And if you have any questions at all about any of this stuff, start out with sales@fusionreactor.com, and they will get it to the right people if they're not the right ones to answer it. And I see I'd answered all the questions, so that's great. So with that, I'll stick around for another minute in case anybody wants to ask a question that they were waiting till the end. But if others of you need to go, I understand. I apologize for going a few minutes over. Thanks for coming. And I'll leave the recording on for a moment just to see if there's a question I can answer for anybody. And this interface doesn't tell me if people are typing, I don't think, because I don't see any questions coming up. And that's great. I'm glad I answered most of them. Okay. Do you have an example of line debugging? Well, when you say line debugging, do you mean stepping through code line by line? Yes, that's a built-in feature of FusionReactor 6 in the Ultimate Edition, and we'll cover that in the next class. That wasn't appropriate for this one, because this was stuff that applied to everybody with every version for the most part. So look for that FusionReactor 6 hidden gems. But even then, I'm not going to focus on the debugger, because that to me is not a hidden thing. That's a major feature of FusionReactor 6. So I'll just tell you, there are videos. There are YouTube videos. And remember, I showed you the online stuff. So up here under support, you could choose video tutorials, or just come here to video tutorials. And look, there's one on the production debugger. So I've done the videos on that, and so yes, I have several videos I've done on the line debugger. Cool feature, check it out. Can you provide any details on FusionReactor cloud licensing? Is it more flexible? What would more flexible be for you? What's not flexible about the current one? I want to make sure I answer, or point you to the right people to answer it. Like, you want to be able to spin up licenses because you're running a cloud. Are you running a cloud deployment? Maybe you're misunderstanding it. Are you running a cloud deployment where you are spinning up licenses? Sorry, you're spinning up instances of your own, and you want to know how to license those instances when they get spun up? Because the FusionReactor cloud is not about you running a cloud. It's about FusionReactor being in the cloud. But I think your question was more about your running a cloud deployment and you're spinning up licenses, right? You're not stuck to an amount of licenses. That's a misunderstanding. I'm pretty sure you're going to find. So, and let me just, don't worry about writing back to me. Send your question to sales. Either you're misunderstanding something or I'm misunderstanding something. I don't think you're stuck the way you think you are. I think FusionReactor already has the flexibility you want, and maybe it's just a relatively new thing that you hadn't checked out. Maybe you're presuming based on some prior experience. So definitely send an email to sales@fusion-reactor.com and just ask about that. Don't mention the cloud, because I don't think that's what you're asking. You're just saying, hey, I want to talk about licensing when I'm spinning up licenses, spinning up machines and instances in a cloud deployment, and they'll get back to you. I'm pretty sure there's an answer there somewhere too already on the site. I just haven't looked at it myself to know the answer. Someone said I mentioned Fusion Analytics does support FusionReactor 6. No, they stopped supporting, FusionReactor 4. No, I'm just kidding. Of course it supports FusionReactor 6. I don't know what would make you ask that question. Sorry, I'm being a little punchy this morning. But yes, it definitely supports FusionReactor 6. Yes. Did you find for some reason that it didn't appear to? Or was, again, you just some presumption from prior experience that has you questioning it? Because yes, I'll just tell you, absolutely it does. Okay, all right, so excellent. Thank you for telling me. So he says that the website only mentions FusionReactor 5 and 4.5. Well, you know what that is about. The person that's responsible for updating things in the docs never got around to it. And seriously, I hope you would please take a moment to just send a quick email to the sales address and point that out, because that's how things get fixed. And these guys are great about that. I mean, we can't expect them to be perfect. They do miss stuff. But when you bring things to their attention, they get them fixed. And let me just share a little story while we wait for any more questions. This is why I'm a big fan of FusionReactor. I've been for 10 years, because 10 years ago, plus when I first started using it, I observed some little things like that, and I sent some observations, as I do for anything I use, whether it's a thing related to cold fusion or thing related to nothing to do with our world of IT. If I see something wrong, I let people know, hey, I just noticed this is wrong. And 9 out of 10 times, they either don't reply, or they reply with a snarky, defensive, who do you think you are telling me how to run my website kind of answer. And I just think, what? I'm just trying to help you. These guys were different from day one, the first time I sent them in an observation like that. They not only fixed it, but they thanked me for bringing it up. I'm telling you, this is the kind of company you want to let them know. Don't just give it. Let's think again, back to Derek's question about the instance licensing, and then Darren's question there about the support. If something on the website doesn't seem right, just send them a question and they will get it fixed. And I'll just tell you, I do too. If I see something wrong, I still bring it up to them. And actually, I now have the authority to modify the docs. So I've recently been tweaking the docs in some ways where I see something wrong and I just go fix it. So they definitely want to do it. And if they don't do it and it's about the docs, send me a note. And if it's quick and obvious, and no question, then I'll do it because they definitely want it to be better. Always better, always improving. All right, well, I think that's it. There's no more questions coming in. We've gone about 10 minutes beyond we should have, so let's go ahead and stop the recording so it's not too long for folks. And we'll see some of you at the FusionReactor 6 presentation in a few weeks, 3 weeks, I think. And then otherwise, let folks know if you think they ought to come and see this one. We'll offer it again in November. And until then, enjoy FusionReactor.